Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this session on the road to COP27. My name's Kate Abnett. I'm a climate change correspondent for Reuters, and it's my pleasure to moderate this panel, where we're going to be discussing the priorities of COP27 host Egypt as it prepares for the event, what the road from COP26 to 27 should look like for financial institutions, and also some of the emerging thinking around COP28 in the UAE. It's never too early. I'll introduce our speakers. We're joined virtually by Her Excellency Dr. Rania Al-Mashat, who is the Minister of International Cooperation for Egypt. Thank you for joining us, Minister. And on the stage, we have Her Excellency Dr. Nawal Al-Hassani, the United Arab Emirates Permanent Representative to the International Renewable Energy Agency. We have Nigel Topping, High-Level Champion for Climate Action from COP26, and Dr. Dalia Abdelkader, Chief Sustainability Officer at Egypt's Commercial International Bank. So thank you all for your participation. Let's begin with Egypt. Minister, you're preparing to host COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh in November. There is already a long list of urgent issues on the table. There's the need to get new NDCs, climate finance, loss and damage, adaptation, the role for non-state actors, and now all of this is playing out against a backdrop of war. So what can you tell us at this stage about Egypt's priorities for COP27?
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for the timely event that bridges between Glasgow and Sharm. And as was emphasized during the previous panel, there is a continuation of work. There have been successes during Glasgow, and it's very important and imperative for us to continue to see them through in Sharm el-Sheikh next November. As president of COP, Egypt is in the continent. However, the position is one of impartiality. But two very important topics come to mind immediately. The importance of adaptation and resilience, particularly for countries that, if we look at the IPCC report, Africa is one of the most affected. The climate statistics are still extremely worrisome. So how can we move ahead on adaptation and resilience, particularly with, as you mentioned, the backdrop of food security, and hence bringing to the forefront agriculture and irrigation. And then comes the very important item, which is there have been so many pledges during Glasgow. Actually, the billions look small now compared to all the commitments that were made. There were trillions. So how can we move these trillions into countries that need it the most? So how can we go from commitments to implementation? And what we want to focus on is the practicality of that. What is required from every stakeholder to ensure that the pledges could make their way into investable projects on the ground. The climate topic is a multi-stakeholder topic. Everybody has a role. Governments need to create the conducive environment for this financing to be there through market access and many other reforms. And as you mentioned as well, try and be clear about their NDCs and their investment maps. But then we have the private sector needs to also be clear about their asks, because these commitments need to be de-risked, and therefore, what is the role of multi-development banks? How can we push more concessionality to ensure that these commitments make it into projects? And then philanthropy also plays a very big role now, because it's not only about finance, it's also about capacity in different countries. And therefore, to be able to create these investable projects, the availing technical assistance, capacity building is something which is extremely important. So I think all what you listed are very, very important carry-throughs from Glasgow to Sharm, but adaptation and resilience, and from commitments to implementation in a practical way, I think these are going to be extremely important, because the financing in general is becoming tighter and tighter given the global context that we are witnessing today.
Minister, thank you. I wanted to pick up on some of the issues you mentioned there, adaptation, capacity building, for example, which are especially pertinent to African countries. And this is, of course, going to be an African COP. So could you say a bit more about how COP27 is going to focus on the specific needs of African countries, be that vulnerabilities to the climate impacts we're already seeing, or difficulties accessing finance for climate investments?
One of the misperceptions, if you will, and this is something that we are trying to put forward, is that adaptation projects are not necessarily non-revenue providing, and therefore trying to make sure that there is a case for the private sector to engage in adaptation projects. When we look at the landscape, how much goes into mitigation versus adaptation, much more goes into mitigation, but the continent needs more when it comes to agriculture, when it comes to irrigation, when it comes to many of the the adaptation landscape. So there is we have with our partners from the different specialized institutions that worked in the continent on projects and in other continents to basically see what are the successful examples, how can we scale them, what is required from every stakeholder to do in order to make sure that these commitments can be implementable and fast. The urgency is there. These projects are important from a climate point of view, but also from a developmental point of view, from an employment point of view. And that's another theme which we're trying to bring forward. Climate is also a development. There's this climate development nexus, and therefore showcasing successful examples, explaining how they can be scaled, and focusing on the process. What is required in the process to be able to move quickly and swiftly the commitments into implementable and investable projects.
Minister, thank you. Let's turn to the UAE now. Dr. Nawal, the UAE committed last year to net zero emissions by 2050. It was the first Middle East and Gulf country to do so. The question now, of course, is how to do it. So what can you tell us about the transition and how the country is approaching this, and particularly thinking from where you sit at IRENA, what role is renewable energy going to play?
Thank you so much for this question. I have to say, I get very happy when people ask me how and not why, because generally we are always asked why you want to do that as a UAE. So that's a fantastic opening for this discussion. I believe for the UAE, we are doing that because it's a moral responsibility. That's number one. Number two, it's actually provide an excellent and a unique opportunity to secure sustainable economic growth for the country. And as the minister mentioned, we are not looking at climate innovation as only an environmental tool, but it's actually a very, very important economical growth opportunity. And for the UAE, we look at, again, cutting emissions and not stopping growth. So we cut emissions, we don't stop growth. And that's why for us it has been very, very important. It is building on 2 decades of UAE investment in climate innovation. We've started this way, way too early. So what we are doing now, the way we are implementing is, as I mentioned, building on what we've done before. There is a huge focus on advancing technology. So one of the first priorities for our government is how we can scale up our investment in advanced technologies to basically help clean our heavy industries. And that's why we restructured. And this is basically, somebody mentioned earlier, the UAE is very systematic in their approach, and that's what we did. So the first thing is we did when we announced that, we looked at our government and how we can enable that growth, that results from maybe adapting new policies and introducing new policies. And our government and our cabinet is actually an enabler for that. So we structured a little bit our government to ensure that we are having the right tools to deliver that. We also had, to your point, we are very blessed and very lucky to have won the bid to host IRENA in the UAE. So for 10 years, for more than 10 years, IRENA has been in the UAE. And building on having such an institute with us in the country, we are investing more in innovation, renewable energy, and sustainable solution. Moving forward, we also have a great focus on building the right talent. So we're investing on our universities, but we're also introducing a lot of enabling policy to attract right talent from around the world to ensure that we are having a clear pipeline of talent when it comes to advancing and achieving our targets for net zero. But we have been always a big believer in the importance of partnership with international organizations, international entities to achieve that and to be able to achieve our targets. And it is a journey. And we've heard today from multiple speakers that, as we move on, we learn by doing, because this hasn't been done before, and we are not claiming that we've known it all. So we are working in that process. But back to your point about IRENA, investing in renewable energy is one of our main pillars towards achieving the net zero by 2050. And if you just give me a few seconds, I would love to give you some statistics of how much we've decided, or how much we invested already, but how much we are going to invest under the net zero strategic initiative. So one of the first announcements is that we are investing further $160 billion in new renewable energy projects in the UAE. And also, we have, to date, invested more than $40 billion in our domestic projects. So, we have in the UAE now 3 of the largest and the lowest cost solar power plants in the world. And again, that's part of the way that we do things. So, we invest in the project, we start with maybe at one point leading edge technologies, which is now, I believe, with the work that we've done with our partners, now became more of mainstream when it comes to solar projects. So this is something that we are very important that we do. Back to our second pillar, which is or the other pillar that we spoke about, is the international partnership. With the work that we are doing with IRENA, we launched at Glasgow earlier, we launched the Energy Transition Accelerator Fund, which is a fund that aims to increase or finance the deployment of approximately 1.5 gigawatt of clean renewable energy around the world. So we are looking that through this partnership, we can have even more investors join us to ensure the acceleration. So just to summarize, the way we do it is we are having enabling policies, investing in technologies, having the right talent, and international cooperation.
Thank you. I think we'll come back to some of those questions about finance, funding that you mentioned later in the panel, as well as COP28. Nigel, I'll turn to you now. So your role as a climate champion focuses on non-state actors. And through the campaigns that you and other champions have launched, you've mobilized a huge number of commitments. More than 5,000 companies in the Race to Zero have made these pledges. Of course, they now need to deliver them. So looking ahead to COP27, what does delivery look like? What do you want these non-state actors to do in practice?
Well, of course, thousands of companies, and remember, Race to Zero is the entry criteria for GFAN, so Mark and I designed that so that robust net zero targets is the foundation on which all the collaboration of GFANs is built. I mean, I think a couple of things. I mean, we feel very strongly that we've finally turned the corner in Glasgow in terms of the COPs being predominantly about implementation. There's still lots to be negotiated. But I don't know, any of you who saw both the Glasgow closing session and the Paris closing session. The Paris closing session was Laurent Fabius asking the parties one question and gavelling one document through. The Glasgow closing session was about an hour and a half of going through well over 100 negotiated items. So the multilateral system has cleared a big sort of bow wave of negotiated items. So there's, in a way, whilst there's still work to be done, particularly on resilience and loss and damage and some of the finance issues, there's more space opened up to focus on solutions. So with Mahmoud now, Dr. Mohideen, the Egyptian appointed champion, we're very focused on how do we, from a non-state actor point of view, make Sharm el-Sheikh really about implementation. So in the finance sector, that means the sort of stuff that Mark was talking about all the members of GFANs actually doing what they promised to do last year and publishing their targets and their pathways to get there. The Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance have already done their 2025 targets, and we'll be seeing the asset managers and the banks, as Mark said before, COP27. I think what we'll also increasingly hear from non-state actors is the need for governments to meet their part of the bargain. You know, we talk about the ambition loop, that private sector can only go so far without government policy clarity, and similarly, government can only go so far without knowing that the private sector is going to go along with it. It's a kind of takes two to tango kind of deal, and every government promised to come back with more ambition every year in Glasgow. So there's a credibility issue from non-state actors, but also from state actors. And I think what non-state actors most want is clarity about, very clear signals about the direction of travel. I mean, for me, the example that illustrates this best is when the UK went to consult on when to phase out combustion engines between 2032 and 2035. Ben Van Buren from Shell said 2030. So, you know, markets like clarity because then they don't waste capital. So that's above all what the private sector are looking for. And then I think echoing very much some of the earlier panels, we need to start really engaging with global sort of intellectual capital of the private sector in innovating for resilience. These are global issues. They are financeable. I mean, it's the biggest market failure in the world. If you look at BlackRock and Moody's, they see a 2050 economy that's about $25 trillion bigger than on the current trajectory. Most of that is avoided losses through investing in adaptation. Right? Why aren't people raising massive adaptation investment funds now? If that's I mean, there has to be a way to make that profitable. So I think it's implementing on existing promises in that sort of exponential growth in that we're seeing in green hydrogen, green steel, EVs, RE, and then really starting to get innovative about how we finance resilience and adaptation. And there, I think one of the instruments we need to talk a lot more about is the rollout of insurance around the world. It's part of what drives development, right? Is because it provides stability for income. Insurance as an approach has been developed when individuals in a city that's burnt down, like London, or rice farmers need security. I think too often in the conversation around loss and damage, which is a negotiated area, we forget that actually society has a pretty good way of dealing with socializing risk, and it's through insurance approaches. And there's some really encouraging things happening, like through Insure Resilience as part of the race to resilience, looking to close the protection gap and get another 500 million people in emerging markets insured by 2025. So I think, and the vulnerable 20 group of countries have started to recognize that and talk about that. So I think it's another area for the finance sector to look for, where there's huge opportunity, yes, for profit, but for profit by driving growth and jobs and development in emerging markets in particular.
Okay, thank you. All of those private sector pledges, of course, need financing. So, Dr. D'Elia, let's talk about the business case for climate investments. Could you set the scene for us in terms of Egypt's financial sector and how it is preparing for COP27, and specifically what you at CRB are doing?
Well, I think Egypt presents a very interesting case for coordination between state and non-state actors to drive system transformation. In Egypt, the financial industry is systematically pursuing the implementation of sustainable finance through a dual-track approach. It's a top-down approach, but yet it's a bottom-up. It's paralleled by a bottom-up approach. Top-down because it's very important that the regulators set the scene, and this has been taking place, and even prior to COP26. In July 2021, both the Central Bank of Egypt and the Financial Regulatory Authority issued sustainable finance guidelines. And they are not cliche guidelines or lip service. They are very comprehensive and very robust and very progressive. That was in July 2021. They talked about environmental and social risk, about climate change risk. They mandated banks to establish sustainable finance departments, issue sustainable finance policy, develop sustainable finance products. It's very comprehensive. However, they seconded the Federation of Egyptian Banks to establish, they mandated the Federation of Egyptian Banks to establish a Sustainable Finance Committee, which I'm honored to be part of, to make sure that this committee manages capacity building to prime and pave the way for banks to see the business case. The Financial Regulatory Authority was a bit direct, making it mandatory for listed companies to report. However, the Central Bank of Egypt was equally compelling. I wouldn't say it's voluntary guidelines. It's more than voluntary, but not mandatory yet, because they were conscious that it should be digested by banks. And this is the role of the Federation of Egyptian Banks, to engage banks, to show them the business case, risk capacity building, and make sure it is well internalized. Sustainability is not an activity that you just do it because it is mandated by regulation. And being part of this committee, it's very impressive that I see banks and my colleagues, once they see the business case, they are craving for how can we do it? And this is where we need the infrastructure and stakeholders. But parallel to the top-down approach, we have a very important ingredient for the systemic transformation, which is the bottom-up approach, the non-state industry actors, and this brings us to the experience of CIB. CIB is Egypt's largest private sector bank, and CIB saw the economic imperative of sustainable finance early on, 6-7 years. We saw the business case. It was not mandated, it was not for compliance. It was because it has a growth-focused strategy. We're honored that we were a founding signatory of the Net Zero Banking Alliance. We just celebrated the first anniversary in April 2021. And we were a founding signatory of the Principles for Responsible Banking in 2019. Why? Because we can see that sustainable finance and climate finance are mega trends. And if we want to sustain our growth, we should learn how to do it even ahead of regulations and compliance. And that was the case. We saw that if we want to generate revenue, it's the trillions of dollars required to fund the SDGs. We all know this. This is common knowledge. If you want to manage our risk management portfolio, we need to broaden risk management beyond the traditional credit or market risk, environmental and social risk, and climate risk. We were the first bank to join the TCFD, again, because of the business case. In the midst of COVID crisis, and that was exactly when I joined CIB, it was in June 2021, and I was very surprised. Why would CIB, in the midst of COVID crisis, when every corporate worldwide was struggling to maintain its profit, they were innovating, and taking the risk to introduce the first green bond in Egypt, issued by a private sector bank, and it was very successful. So what does this tell you? That in times of crisis, you just need to innovate, change your business models, because crisis brings with them opportunities. Only if we change the business models. The green bond was very successful. It was issued for $100 million in coordination with the IFC. Under the green bond, we had a portfolio of sustainable finance products, green building, energy efficiency, renewable energy, green transportation, and guess what? They opened a new territory for banks. And it was not only that the bank innovated and developed new business models internally, we had to engage our clients because, again, for our clients, our risk management system should not deter or turn off our clients, even if it's fossil fuel. We had to engage our clients in gatherings like this to show them the business case of sustainable finance. How does our new system help them grow, help them export, help them save on their energy? So, along with internal system transformation, we paved the way for the transition in the economy as a whole. So we issued Sustaining Sectors Program. Last month, we hosted food and beverage. End of this month, we're hosting building construction to help them get certified with LEED and energy, to engage them. It's not that we want to promote our products. In the way we are, but we are building the business case. So we can see that state and non-state actors, if done properly, we see the business case, and I want to second.
I'm going to have to ask you to stop there. I'm so sorry. We're absolutely out of time. But
that was always my challenge, I told you.
But that message about the collaboration between state and non-state actors, I guess that's a good way to finish.